Nobody expects a paint color to start a war, but mine did. The morning the letter arrived, sunlight was still slipping through the blinds when I opened the envelope and read the words that made my coffee taste like metal. According to the Homeowners Association, my house color violated community rules and I had 10 days to repaint it or face fines. I stood in the kitchen staring at the paper, certain there had been some mistake. I had chosen this shade carefully, after checking every guideline before the brush ever touched the wall. What bothered me most was not the threat of fines, but the certainty that I had done everything right. Months earlier, when I first moved into the neighborhood, I had requested a copy of the official HOA regulations. I remember sitting at the dining table with a highlighter, marking the section about exterior paint colors. The document listed approved shades, and the one now covering my home was right there in plain text. I had even saved a photo of that page on my phone, just in case. So how could they now claim I was breaking rules that I had followed exactly? I walked outside and looked at my house, the warm earthy tone glowing gently under the morning sun. It blended perfectly with the landscape, matching the sample code from the document. Neighbors passed by, offering normal waves, unaware that my home had apparently become a violation overnight. I felt a strange mix of confusion and quiet anger building in my chest. I called the number on the letter. A polite but firm voice told me the board had updated its guidelines and my color was no longer acceptable. When I asked when this change happened, there was a pause. Then came the answer that made everything feel suspicious. The change had been made 2 weeks ago, during a meeting I had never been notified about. That was the moment I realized this was not about paint. This was about power. I went back inside, opened my file cabinet, and pulled out the folder labeled HOA. Inside were printed emails, approval receipts, and the original document I had downloaded when I moved in. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages, searching for proof I knew existed. I spread the papers across the table, aligning dates, signatures, and approval stamps like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a picture. Every page told the same story. I had followed procedure, submitted samples, and received written confirmation. The evidence was factual, undeniable, waiting patiently to be noticed. And there it was. The exact clause. The exact color code. The exact rule they were now pretending had never existed. I stared at the clause for a long time, as if it might suddenly rearrange itself and prove me wrong. It didn't. The ink was clear, the language precise, and the color code printed there matched the one on the paint can still sitting in my garage. The rule wasn't vague. It wasn't open to interpretation. It was direct, simple, and undeniably in my favor. What confused me most was why the HOA board would risk challenging something so easily verifiable. Either they hadn't checked their own records, or they were counting on me not having kept mine. Both possibilities told me something important about how this was going to unfold. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my gallery until I found the photo I had taken months ago. The date stamp confirmed it was from the week I moved in. I zoomed in on the section about approved colors and felt a strange calm wash over me. They could send letters, threaten fines, and talk about new guidelines, but they could not erase what had already been written. Still, I knew this wouldn't be solved with a simple phone call. That afternoon, I decided to visit the HOA office in person. The building sat near the entrance of the community, small but neat, with a flag out front and neatly trimmed hedges. I walked in carrying my folder, trying to keep my expression neutral. A receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile and asked how she could help. I received a violation notice, I said, placing the letter gently on the counter. But I believe there's been a mistake. She took the letter and disappeared into a back room. Minutes later, a man I recognized from the neighborhood meeting stepped out. He was one of the board members, someone who always spoke confidently about maintaining standards and community harmony. He motioned for me to follow him into a small conference room. I laid my documents out on the table before he could begin. I watched his expression carefully as his eyes moved from page to page. At first, he seemed calm. Then his brow tightened slightly. He flipped through the pages again, slower this time, as if hoping to find a loophole. "These are old documents," he said finally. "We revised the guidelines recently." "I understand that," I replied evenly. "But these were the rules when I painted my house. I followed them exactly, and I have written approval." He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly on the table. "The community standards evolve. Residents are expected to comply with updates." That sentence told me everything. They were trying to apply new rules to old actions. And they were hoping I would simply accept it? I left the office with a strange mix of frustration and clarity. They weren't confused, and they weren't mistaken. They were deliberate. That realization settled into me like cold rain. Outside, the afternoon air felt heavier than usual, and the quiet streets of the neighborhood looked different. The houses seemed less friendly, the sidewalks less welcoming, as if something invisible had shifted. I walked slowly back toward my home, replaying every word from the conversation in my head. The board members' calm tone now felt rehearsed, like someone repeating a script practiced many times before. This wasn't the first time they had tried something like this, I realized. I just happened to be the person prepared enough to notice. When I reached my driveway, I paused and studied the house again. The color looked peaceful, warm, and entirely harmless. Yet somehow it had turned into a problem big enough for official letters, meetings, and warnings. I stepped inside and placed the folder on the kitchen counter, then sat quietly for several minutes, thinking. If they were willing to rewrite history, I needed more than paper proof. I needed context, dates, witnesses, and records beyond what I already had. I opened my laptop and logged into the community portal, searching through archived announcements and newsletters. Buried between holiday event posts and landscaping reminders, I found something interesting. A meeting summary from 3 months earlier mentioned proposed changes to exterior guidelines. Proposed, not approved. The wording was careful, almost cautious, stating that residents would be notified before any rule became active. I searched my email inbox using every keyword I could think of. Nothing appeared. No notification, no update, no vote results. Just silence. That silence felt louder than the letter they had sent. It suggested either carelessness or intention. Neither option reflected well on them. I took screenshots of the portal pages and saved them into a new folder labeled Evidence. Then I printed copies, sliding them beside the original documents on the counter. The pile was growing, and with it, my confidence. This was no longer about defending a paint choice. It was about exposing a process that quietly ignored its own rules. I could feel the direction of the situation changing. They expected compliance. What they were about to receive was resistance backed by facts, patience, and documentation. For the first time since opening that letter, I felt something different from anger. I felt focused, calm, prepared, ready to push back in a way they wouldn't expect. And this time, I wouldn't walk into their office alone. I would walk in with proof so organized and clear that denying it would expose more than my house color. It would expose them, completely, publicly, and undeniably. That thought steadied me. That evening, I began organizing everything like I was preparing a legal case. The dining table disappeared beneath neat stacks of papers, highlighted lines, and handwritten notes. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was building a timeline. First came the original HOA document with the approved paint codes. Then the email confirming my color sample had been accepted. Next, the receipt from the paint store with the exact code printed clearly on the label. After that, the screenshots from the community portal showing that rule changes had only been proposed, not enacted, at the time I painted my house. Each item connected to the next like links in a chain. The more I arranged it, the clearer the pattern became. They had changed the rules quietly, without proper notification, and were now attempting to enforce them retroactively. That wasn't just unfair. It violated their own procedures. I realized something important then. This situation wasn't about arguing emotionally. It was about presenting facts so plainly that the argument would collapse on its own. The next morning, I knocked on the door of my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Dalton. She had lived in the community for over 15 years and had attended more HOA meetings than anyone else I knew. When I explained what had happened, she raised her eyebrows in surprise. "They can't do that," she said immediately. "Rule changes require a resident vote and written notice." "Did you receive any notice?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not a single one." That was the first confirmation I needed. Over the next few hours, I spoke with 3 more neighbors. None of them had received notification about updated exterior guidelines. One of them even mentioned repainting his fence recently using the same old document I had used. By midday, I wasn't alone in this anymore. People were starting to realize that if the HOA could rewrite rules for me, they could do it for anyone. I typed up a simple summary of the situation, attached copies of the evidence, and sent it to the neighbors who were willing to stand with me. Within an hour, replies began coming back, supportive and slightly alarmed. The issue had grown beyond a paint color. It had become a question of trust. That afternoon, I received another email from the HOA reminding me of the deadline to repaint. The tone was firmer this time, almost impatient. I read it slowly, then smiled for the first time since this began. They still believed this was a simple compliance issue. They had no idea what was waiting for them at the next meeting. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the small community hall near the entrance gate. Normally, these meetings were quiet affairs attended by a handful of residents who mostly listened while the board discussed landscaping budgets and parking complaints. This time felt different before it even began. I arrived early, carrying a neatly organized binder instead of loose papers. Behind me walked Mrs. Dalton and 2 other neighbors who had agreed to attend after reading my summary. Their presence alone changed how I felt. I was no longer walking in as a single homeowner defending a paint color. I was walking in with witnesses. The board members sat at the front table, shuffling papers and speaking softly among themselves. When they noticed more residents than usual taking seats, their expressions shifted slightly. Curious. Cautious. When the meeting opened for resident concerns, I stood up calmly. "I'd like to discuss the violation notice I received regarding my home's paint color," I began, keeping my voice steady and polite. One of the board members nodded, clearly expecting a simple exchange. "Yes, we've addressed that. The guidelines were updated." I walked forward and placed my binder on the table in front of them. "I understand that. But I believe the timeline and procedure of those updates are important." I opened to the first page, the original HOA document. Then the approval email. Then the receipt. Then the screenshots from the portal showing the rule changes were only proposed at the time I painted my home. I didn't speak much. I let the pages do the talking. The room grew very quiet. I could feel the shift happening as the board members looked from one document to the next. Their confidence began to thin, replaced by something less certain. One of them adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to read. Another whispered something to the person beside him. Then Mrs. Dalton stood up behind me. "I've lived here 15 years, she said clearly. "We were never notified of any official rule change. And rule changes require a vote." A murmur moved through the room. More residents began nodding. The board had expected a complaint. Instead, they were facing a pattern. And it was now visible to everyone. For a long moment, no one at the front table spoke. Papers that once looked authoritative now seemed fragile under the weight of quiet eyes watching from every chair in the room. I could see it in their faces. They had expected to control the narrative. Instead, the narrative was controlling them. One board member cleared his throat. "We may need to review these documents more carefully," he said, choosing his words slowly. I nodded. "That's all I'm asking. A fair review based on the rules that existed when I painted my home." But the silence behind me had turned into something stronger than support. It had become awareness. Residents were whispering to each other, some pulling out their phones, likely checking their own emails for notices they now realized never came. Another neighbor stood up. "If rules changed without a vote, that's a bigger issue than a paint color." That sentence landed heavily in the room. Because it was true. The discussion shifted. It was no longer centered on my house. It was centered on the HOA's process, transparency, and accountability. Questions started coming from all directions. When exactly were the rules changed? Where was the vote record? Why were residents not notified? The board members began flipping through their own folders, searching for answers that didn't seem to be there. I stayed quiet. I didn't need to speak anymore. The evidence had done its work, and now the residents were doing the rest. Finally, the board president raised his hand to calm the room. "We will suspend the violation notice until we complete a full review of the documentation and meeting records." Suspend. Not enforce. That single word felt like the first crack in a wall they had assumed was solid. I thanked them politely and returned to my seat. But inside, I knew this was only the beginning. A review meant they would have to look backward, and when they did, they would find more than just my situation. They would find a pattern of shortcuts. And once people see that, they don't unsee it. The days after the meeting felt strangely quiet, like the pause after thunder when you're waiting to hear what the storm damaged. No new letters arrived. No emails. No reminders about repainting deadlines. Just silence from the HOA, which somehow felt louder than their threats had. But the neighborhood was anything but silent. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a polite greeting were now stopping me during evening walks. They asked questions about the documents, about the meeting, about how I had kept such detailed records. Some shared their own concerns about past decisions the HOA had made that never quite felt right but were never questioned. It was becoming clear that the situation had touched something deeper than a rule dispute. People were realizing how much power they had quietly handed over without asking for accountability in return. One afternoon, Mrs. Dalton knocked on my door holding a small stack of papers. "You might want to see this," she said. They were copies of old meeting minutes she had kept from years ago. She had a habit of saving things just in case. As we sat at the table flipping through them, a pattern started to emerge. Several rule changes over the years had been marked as board decisions rather than resident-approved amendments. That distinction mattered. Very much. It meant the board had been gradually bypassing the voting process for a long time, and no one had noticed because the changes seemed minor at the time. Fence heights. Garden decorations. Mailbox styles. Until now. Now, people were looking. That evening, a small group of residents gathered at my house. We spread documents across the table again, comparing old records with current guidelines posted on the community portal. The differences were subtle but undeniable. Someone said quietly, "This isn't about paint anymore." And they were right. This was about restoring a voice the neighborhood didn't realize it had lost. By the end of the week, what started as a single violation notice had turned into a neighborhood-wide investigation. Not an official one, not with lawyers or formal complaints, but something just as powerful. Residents were talking, comparing notes, checking old emails, and asking questions they had never thought to ask before. The HOA board, meanwhile, remained unusually quiet. That silence made everyone more alert. One neighbor discovered an old email from years ago where a rule change had been announced as effective immediately, with no mention of a vote. Another found printed newsletters that referenced updates but never asked for resident approval. Each discovery added another piece to the growing picture. It wasn't dramatic. There was no scandalous revelation. Just a slow, undeniable realization that procedures had been skipped repeatedly because no one had challenged them. Until now. Mrs. Dalton suggested something simple but powerful. We should request a full review meeting. Not about your house. About the process. So we drafted a respectful letter signed by 12 residents asking the board to provide records of votes for every rule change made in the past 5 years. The wording was polite, careful, and impossible to dismiss as emotional. When the letter was delivered, the reaction was immediate. The board scheduled a special meeting for the following Tuesday. That alone told us everything. They knew they had to address this publicly. As Tuesday approached, I felt a strange calm again. The fear and frustration from the first day had completely disappeared. In its place was something steadier. Confidence, not just in my own situation, but in what the neighborhood was becoming. People were paying attention. And once people start paying attention, systems have to start behaving properly. Tuesday night, the community hall was fuller than anyone had seen in years. Chairs had to be brought in from storage. Neighbors who had never attended a single HOA meeting were now sitting quietly, waiting, curious and alert. The atmosphere felt different from the usual routine discussions. This felt important. The board members entered with thick folders and noticeably serious expressions. There were no casual smiles this time, no light conversation before the meeting began. Papers were arranged carefully, microphones adjusted, and for the first time, it seemed like they understood the weight of the moment. The board president stood and spoke first. Over the past few days, we have reviewed our records regarding rule changes and voting procedures. We want to acknowledge that, in several instances, proper resident voting and notification did not occur as required by our governing documents. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Not shock. Confirmation. They continued, explaining that many updates had been implemented as temporary adjustments that were never formally voted on later. What had started as shortcuts had slowly turned into a habit. Then came the sentence that tied everything back to where this began. Regarding the paint color violation, the homeowner followed the rules that were officially in place at the time. The violation notice is hereby withdrawn. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. But the real victory wasn't mine alone. The board went on to announce that all rule changes from the past 5 years would be reviewed and presented for proper resident voting. Notification procedures would be rewritten and documented clearly. Transparency, they admitted, had to be restored.
As the meeting ended, people didn't rush out. They stayed talking in small groups, discussing ideas, sharing thoughts. There was a sense of ownership in the room that hadn't exposed before. I walked outside into the cool night air and looked down the street toward unchanged, as if of this had over happened. But something had changed, not the paint, the people, and that was far more powerful.